A land before England, the Isles in chaos. Imagine standing on a cold, misty shore, somewhere along the edge of what we now call England. The wind bites, the waves crash, and beyond the grey horizon lies uncertainty. There are no kings here yet, no London, no England, just a wild land, fractured by tribes, haunted by memory, and waiting for an identity that hasn't been born. This is Britain after the fall of Rome, a land abandoned by empire and plunged into chaos. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman rule had brought roads, cities, and laws. But when the legion sailed home in the early 5th century, they left behind something fragile, a people unsure of who they were without their conquerors. Picture it: ruined villas overgrown with ivy, Roman baths cold and silent, towns slowly emptying as trade collapses. The old order had vanished. The Britons, the Celtic people who had lived under Rome's shadow, were left to fend for themselves against waves of raiders sweeping in from every direction. From the north came the Picts, fierce warriors from what we now call Scotland. From across the Irish Sea came the Scots and the wild tribes of Hibernia. And from the east, the most fateful direction of all, came the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. These were seafaring tribes from the coasts of northern Europe, searching for new lands, new lives, and sometimes new conquests. At first they were invited. That's the part most people forget. According to old chronicles, British leaders, desperate for protection, hired Saxon mercenaries to help fight their enemies. But those mercenaries soon realised something. This land was rich, fertile, and weakly defended. So they stayed. They brought their families, and slowly their settlements began to spread like ripples in a pond. The result was a collision, not just of armies, but of worlds. Celtic and Roman, Saxon and Briton, each fighting to define what Britain would become. The countryside turned into a mosaic of warring kingdoms, each claiming power over the ruins of old towns. We don't have many written records from this time. What we do have are whispers, stories, later written down by monks trying to make sense of the chaos. Some called it the time of Arthur, when a legendary leader may have tried, for a brief and shining moment, to hold back the darkness. Whether Arthur truly lived or not, the myth itself shows how desperate people were for unity, for a hero who could stand against the tide. But unity was still far away. Across the island, languages shifted, traditions clashed, and entire villages vanished. Old Roman stonework was reused to build wooden halls for new Saxon lords. Christianity retreated into the hills of Wales and the north, while new settlers forged their own ways of life on English soil. To an ordinary farmer in those years, life must have felt like walking through the ashes of a dream. The old world was gone, and the new one was violent, uncertain, and raw. Yet out of that chaos something remarkable was forming, not by design, but by endurance, because that's how England would be born, not through a single moment of creation, but through centuries of struggle, through invasion, survival, and the slow blending of cultures that refused to die. The Celts, the Saxons, and later the Norse, all would leave their fingerprints on this land. So when we speak of England, we're really speaking of a place that emerged from ruin, a phoenix built from fragments of broken kingdoms, a land that had to forget before it could remember who it was meant to be. And that's where our story begins. The empire has fallen, the tribes are rising, and far to the south, in a small kingdom called Wessex, the first sparks of unity are about to catch fire. The coming of the Saxons picture. The English coastline in the 5th century, quiet, rugged, and full of ghosts. The Roman ships are long gone, the watchtowers stand empty. Somewhere inland, a frightened villager looks toward the sea and sees sails on the horizon, striped, unfamiliar, and unstoppable. That's how the Saxons came. not as one great army, but as countless small bands, adventurers, settlers, families, crossing the cold waters from the lands we now call Germany and Denmark. They came with spears, wooden shields, and a determination to claim new land. They came not to admire Britain's beauty, but to conquer it. At first, they were hired swords. The desperate Britons, leaderless after Rome's departure, invited these foreign warriors to help fight the Picts and the Scots. It was a deal born out of fear, and fear often breeds disaster. Because once the Saxons saw how fertile this land was, with its green valleys and gentle rivers, they decided to stay. And they didn't just stay. They multiplied. What began as an alliance quickly turned into an invasion. More ships arrived. Villages burned. The Britons, already weakened, were pushed west, into the hills of Wales, into Cornwall, into the misty borders where Celtic voices would survive for centuries. The Saxons, meanwhile, began to carve out their new home. They built wooden halls on old Roman ruins. They named the rivers and hills in their own tongue, the language that would one day become English. Londinium became London, Eboracum became Iorforwic, later York. Bit by bit, the old Latin world was replaced by something rougher, simpler, but deeply alive. It's strange to think about. The people who destroyed so much of Roman Britain were also the ones who laid the foundation for England itself. Their world was built around kinship, loyalty, and courage, values that would echo for centuries in English lore and legend. Imagine life in one of those early Saxon settlements. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of axes chopping through forest, longhouses lined with animal hides, children chasing dogs in muddy yards. Every evening fires burned bright while warriors told stories of heroes and their daring deeds. This was more than conquest. It was transformation. With every new settlement came a shift in identity. Britain was no longer Roman, nor purely Celtic. It was something new, a place of mingled blood and culture, and yet amid all this growth, there was violence. For the Britons, the coming of the Saxons was a tragedy, an age of smoke and mourning. For the newcomers, it was destiny fulfilled. History rarely belongs to one side. It's written in the spaces between, in the fields where Roman coins and Saxon brooches lie buried together. Over time, the Angles joined them from the north, and the Jutes from the southern coast. Together they formed small kingdoms, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, each with its own chieftains, its own ambitions, and its own culture. No one yet imagined a single England, not even the Saxons themselves. They were simply survivors carving order from chaos. But through their language, their customs, and their stubbornness, they planted the seeds of a nation. So if you walked across Britain in those years, you'd see a patchwork of worlds, Roman ruins beside new settlements, Latin prayers whispered in one valley and Saxon voices in the next, a land divided, but alive again. And somewhere in that tangled landscape, a new identity was stirring, one that would soon reshape the island forever. Because as the Saxons settled, they began to build more than homes. They built kingdoms, and from those kingdoms, the dream of unity would rise, forged not by peace, but by the endless struggle to survive. Next, we'll step into that fractured world, 7 rival realms, 7 competing crowns, in a time history remembers as the Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms, 1 island. The Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms, 1 island. Imagine standing on a hill in early medieval Britain. Below you stretches a land of smoke and banners, tiny kingdoms with big dreams, each one calling itself the rightful heir to this island. No single ruler, no united realm. Just 7 rival thrones, circling each other like wolves under a grey English sky. This was the Heptarchy, the age of 7 kingdoms, a name later given by historians, but the reality was far messier than any schoolbook map. The 7 were never truly 7. Some rose, some fell, and others were swallowed whole, but their names would echo through centuries. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Together, they were the heartbeat of a nation that didn't yet know it was becoming one. Let's step into that world. To the north, beyond the Humber River, lay Northumbria, fierce and learned. Its monks lit candles in stone monasteries while its kings marched to war. It was here, in places like Lindisfarne and Jarrow, that Christianity began to flourish again, carried on parchment and prayer. Yet even faith couldn't keep peace for long. Kings were overthrown almost as quickly as they were crowned. Further south was Mercia, the muscle of the Midlands. Mercia was power-hungry, ambitious, and often brutal. Under kings like Offa, it became the superpower of its age, the kind of kingdom that built dikes the size of walls just to mark its borders. Offa himself dealt with Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, as an equal. For a moment Mercia looked ready to forge all England under one banner, but power in this era was as fleeting as summer sunlight. When Offa died, Mercia's dominance faded with him. To the east, East Anglia and Kent thrived on trade. Their harbours brought in ships from Frisia, Francia, and beyond. Coins, glass, silk, treasures from faraway lands. The sea was their lifeline, their connection to the wider world. Yet with every tide came the shadow of new invaders. Then there were the Essex and Sussex kingdoms, smaller, often overshadowed, but stubborn in their independence. They were reminders that even the tiniest realm could shape the greater story. And finally, to the southwest, there was Wessex, at first a modest land, often bullied by its larger neighbours. But quietly, patiently, Wessex began to rise. Its kings learned from their rivals' mistakes. They built stronger armies, better laws, and deeper loyalty among their people. Wessex was the seed from which England would eventually grow, though no one could see it yet. Life in the Heptarchy was unpredictable. Alliances changed like weather. A king might dine in triumph one season and fall by a rival's sword the next. Yet out of that constant struggle came something remarkable: identity. Each kingdom began developing its own laws, dialects, and customs. Their courts spoke Old English, not Latin, and their people saw themselves not as Romans or Britons, but as Angles and Saxons. For the first time, the island's people were building a culture that was theirs alone. But while these kingdoms fought each other, a greater danger was gathering across the sea. Men in longships with dragon-headed prows and hearts hardened by the northern cold. The Vikings were coming, and their arrival would test everything the Heptarchy had built. Still, before that storm there was brilliance. The monks of Northumbria illuminated manuscripts so beautiful they looked like stained glass. The rulers of Mercia and Wessex struck silver coins bearing their names, tiny symbols of kings who wanted to be remembered, and across every shire and settlement the English language itself was taking root, word by word, farm by farm. 7 kingdoms, 1 island, countless rivalries. But beneath it all, a shared story was forming. The slow heartbeat of a nation being born through conflict and courage. Because unity doesn't come from peace alone. It comes from surviving the chaos together, and soon one man would rise from that chaos. A king who dreamed not of 7 crowns, but of 1. His name was Alfred, and he would be called the Great. Alfred the Great, the king who fought the darkness. Close your eyes and imagine England in the late 9th century. A land on fire. Villages burned to ash. Monasteries silent and empty. Smoke curling over the ruins of once proud kingdoms. The Viking longships had come like a storm, and no one seemed able to stop them. This was the world Alfred inherited. A young king of a battered kingdom called Wessex, surrounded by enemies and shadows. When he took the throne, England was not a country. It was a memory, broken into fragments, each one struggling to survive. But Alfred refused to let that memory die. He wasn't born a warrior. In fact, as a child he was often sickly, more interested in books and faith than battle. Yet life had other plans. When the Vikings swept across the land, slaughtering kings and enslaving thousands, Alfred found himself leading what was left of the English resistance. For a time, it seemed hopeless. In the dark winter of 878, Alfred's army was crushed, and he was forced into hiding. A king without a kingdom. Imagine it. England's last hope living in the marshes of Somerset, wet, cold, and hunted. There's an old legend that says one day, while hiding in a peasant's hut, Alfred was asked to watch over some loaves of bread baking by the fire. Lost in thought about his ruined kingdom, he let them burn. The woman scolded him fiercely, not realizing she was speaking to her king. Alfred said nothing, just accepted her anger. It's a small story, maybe even a myth, but it tells you something about the man, his humility, his patience, and his refusal to give up, even when the world seemed lost. Because Alfred didn't stay in those swamps forever. From the marshes he gathered his followers, farmers, soldiers, monks, anyone who still believed in a future for England. He rebuilt his army, small but determined, and struck back. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred's men faced the great heathen army, the most feared Viking force in Europe. Against all odds, they won. It wasn't just a victory of swords, it was a victory of will. After the battle, Alfred made peace with the Viking leader Guthrum, but on his own terms. Guthrum was baptized as a Christian, and the land was divided, the south for the Saxons, the north for the Danes. It was an uneasy peace, but it gave Alfred something priceless, time. And Alfred used that time to rebuild more than walls. He rebuilt a nation. He reorganized his army, built a navy to defend against Viking raids, and constructed a network of fortified towns called burhs. Each one was a safe haven, a place where ordinary people could stand and fight rather than run. These burhs became the backbone of what would one day be England's first cities. But Alfred's greatness wasn't just forged on the battlefield. He believed that knowledge was as vital as strength. He brought scholars from across Europe, translated Latin texts into English, and encouraged literacy among his people. He once said, "Learning has decayed among the English." And then he set out to change that. Imagine that. A king who spent as much time with books as with blades. A warrior scholar who saw that saving his people's minds was just as important as saving their bodies. Alfred's laws were fair and deeply moral, rooted in both justice and faith. He envisioned a kingdom where law wasn't just about punishment, but about community, about creating a society worth defending. By the time of his death, Alfred had done something extraordinary. He hadn't just survived, he had transformed a desperate land into the foundation of a united England. The darkness had been beaten back, not completely, but enough for light to take hold again. And that light would be carried forward by his children and their children, who would turn his fragile dream into a kingdom. Because Alfred didn't just fight for land, he fought for an idea, that people could be one nation, bound not by fear, but by faith, law, and shared purpose. He became known as Alfred the Great, the only English king ever given that title, and even now, more than 1,000 years later, his shadow still stretches across England's fields, towns, and language. But Alfred's victory was only the beginning. The Vikings weren't gone, the borders still bled, and the kings who came after him would have to fight again, not just for survival, but for unity. Next, we'll see what happened after Alfred's triumph, how his children carried his torch, and how the dream of one England began to take shape. The Viking shadow. Raiders, traders, and rulers. Picture the coast of England at dawn. A pale mist clings to the sea, and out of it glides a line of ships, long, sleek, and carved with dragon heads. The water whispers around their hulls. Inside, men grip axes and shields, their faces painted and silent. To the people on shore, it must have felt like watching the end of the world arrive. For generations, the Vikings had been England's nightmare. Raiders from the frozen north who came without warning, burned what they found, and vanished before anyone could fight back. They attacked monasteries, the very heart of learning and faith, because that's where the silver was kept. Holy men were dragged from their altars, and gold chalices turned into loot. To the monks who wrote the chronicles, the word Viking meant terror. But history is rarely so simple, because those same men who came to plunder also came to stay. They weren't just destroyers, they were settlers, farmers, and traders, and in time they became part of the land they once raided. After Alfred's victory at Edington, England was divided. The south remained under Saxon rule, but the north and east became the Danelaw, the realm of the Danes. There, Viking law, language, and customs ruled. Towns like York, once Forwick, became thriving Norse cities, full of merchants from across the sea. Imagine walking through one of those markets. The smell of smoked fish and tarred wood, the chatter of voices speaking Old Norse and Old English side by side, silver coins stamped with both Saxon kings and Viking warlords. It wasn't a clash of civilizations anymore, it was a fusion. And that's the strange beauty of this era. The very people who once brought destruction helped rebuild what they had broken. They taught new ways of shipbuilding, new styles of art, new forms of trade. The English learned from them, borrowed from them, and in the process became stronger. Still, peace was fragile. The Viking spirit never fully rested. Every few decades new fleets arrived, ambitious jarls and kings seeking glory. Some came not to raid but to rule. The greatest of them was Cnut the Great, a Danish prince who would one day unite England, Denmark and Norway under a single crown. But that's a story still to come. In Alfred's time and his children's, the Viking shadow lingered, a constant reminder that unity could vanish overnight. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, spent their lives continuing his mission. They built fortresses, reclaimed towns, and pushed back the Danelaw one stone wall at a time. It was a slow, grinding effort, less about glorious battles and more about endurance. Every reclaimed village was a victory, every rebuilt church a statement. England lives. Yet even as the Saxons expanded, they couldn't erase the Norse influence. Viking words slipped into the English tongue, simple ones like sky, egg, and knife. Viking place names filled the map, towns ending in by, thorpe, or thwaite. The legacy of the North was written into the very landscape. So when we talk about England's birth, it isn't a pure story of one people triumphing over another. It's a story of mixing, of violence, yes, but also adaptation. The Vikings didn't just raid, they reshaped the English world. And perhaps that's why their legend never died. They embodied everything the age admired: courage, freedom, and fate. Even their enemies respected them. In time, English kings would trace their ancestry to Viking blood, as if to borrow some of that wild strength for themselves. By the early 10th century, the Saxons were winning the land back, but the Vikings had left something behind that couldn't be undone, a toughness in the English spirit, born from surviving them. The shadow of the Vikings would never truly fade. It would stretch all the way into the next age, into kings who wore both Saxon and Norse crowns. But before that, something remarkable was happening. England was learning how to stand again, how to govern itself, how to think of unity not as a dream, but as destiny. Because even in the long shadow of the Vikings, the light that Alfred had kindled was still burning, and that light, law, learning, and order would lead to the next chapter in England's rebirth, the making of a nation, law, literacy, and learning. When Alfred the Great dreamed of a united England, he didn't just picture armies or borders, he pictured minds. He understood something that few warlords ever did, that a kingdom is not built on conquest alone, but on the quiet power of ideas. And so, While his enemies sharpened swords, Alfred sharpened pens. After years of battle, he looked around at what the wars had left behind. A land bruised and illiterate. Churches burned, monasteries empty, libraries gone. Once the monks of Lindisfarne and Jarrow had copied wisdom by candlelight. Now even priests could barely read the prayers they were meant to recite. Alfred called it a nation fallen into ignorance, and to him, ignorance was as deadly as any Danish axe, so he began a revolution of words. He gathered scholars from across his fragile kingdom, from Mercia, from Wessex, from beyond the seas, and brought them to his court at Winchester. There, amidst the ashes of war, they built something new, the foundations of English learning. Latin, once the tongue of the church and the elite, was no longer enough. Alfred wanted knowledge for the people, in their own language. He ordered translations of great works, the pastoral care of Pope Gregory, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and even the histories of Bede. But he didn't just have them translated, he helped translate them himself. Imagine that. A king hunched over parchment, not plotting invasions, but carefully turning Latin words into the rhythm of Old English. He wasn't just ruling, he was teaching his people how to think, and it worked. For the first time, English began to sound like the language of authority, of record, of faith. It was no longer the speech of the fields and the firelight. It was the speech of kings. Alfred's scribes began keeping records, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, year by year in English. They wrote of plagues, of comets, of wars, and of peace. It was more than a chronicle. It was a declaration that England existed. But Alfred's reforms went beyond the mind. He reformed law, weaving together old customs with Christian justice. The king's law, he said, must reflect both mercy and order. He compiled ancient tribal codes and biblical commandments into something new, a moral framework for a new kind of kingdom. Not just a land ruled by power, but one ruled by principle. Under Alfred's hand, the idea of England began to take shape. Schools opened beside churches. Learning became an act of loyalty. Monks became administrators. Scribes became historians. And Englishmen began to see themselves not as scattered tribes, but as one people with one destiny. And that's what made Alfred truly great. He didn't just save England from the Vikings, he saved it from forgetting itself. His greatest victory wasn't won with a sword, but with a sentence. Because long after the fires of war faded, his words remained, carved not in stone but in language. And from that language a nation began to speak its own name, Englaland, Edward the Elder and Æthelflæd, the builders of unity. When Alfred the Great died, England stood at a fragile edge, half dream, half memory. The Vikings still ruled much of the north and east, and the idea of a single English kingdom seemed more prayer than plan. Into that uncertainty stepped his son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, two rulers bound by blood, vision, and quiet determination. Edward inherited not just his father's crown, but his unfinished work. He was no conqueror in the boastful sense, no grand speeches, no glorious parades. He ruled with calculation, not impulse. While his father had forged the idea of unity, Edward began the slow, practical labour of building it. But he didn't do it alone. To the west, his sister Æthelflæd, widow of the Mercian Lord Ethelred, became one of the most remarkable leaders of her age. In a time when women were rarely seen in war councils, she commanded armies. When cities fell, she rebuilt them. When the Danes advanced, she struck back with precision and fury. The people of Mercia called her simply My Lady, and that title carried both reverence and love. Together, brother and sister moved like two hands shaping the same clay. Edward secured Wessex. Æthelflæd fortified Mercia. They built burhs, fortified towns of earth and timber, across the land linked by roads and garrisons. Each one was a promise of safety, a statement that England would not fall again. Behind every wall life returned, markets reopened, farmers tilled, scribes wrote, and bells rang once more. Their campaign was not just military, it was spiritual. Every Bzur was a candle in the darkness, pushing back the shadow of the Danelaw one flame at a time. The Danes, once unstoppable, found themselves trapped between a brother and a sister who fought with patience and purpose. Æthelflæd especially became a legend. Chronicles tell of her leading troops into battle, rallying her men with calm authority. She captured Derby, Leicester, and turned her gaze toward York itself. The Northumbrians, weary of their Viking overlords, whispered of submitting to her rule. But before she could claim that final victory, she fell ill and died in the summer of the year 918. Edward wept, they say, not just for his sister, but for the half of himself that had gone with her. Yet he continued her work. When Mercia mourned its lady, Edward moved swiftly to unify the land she had secured. The dream that had once belonged to Alfred now seemed within reach. By the end of Edward's reign, the map of England looked different. The line between Dane and Saxon blurred. The burghs stood strong, law and order stretched further than ever before, and though the north still held out, the shadow of Viking power lingering in York, the heart of England now beat as one. It was a quiet revolution, built not on grand battles but on endurance, family and faith in the slow, steady work of peace. Alfred had imagined the nation. Edward and Æthelflæd had built its bones. When historians later called Edward the Elder, it wasn't just to mark his age. It was to honour his place as the father of kings. And Æthelflæd, long forgotten by chroniclers who found little room for queens of war, remains the unsung architect of unity. Together, they didn't just inherit England, they built it. The Danelaw. England divided. Imagine riding through England in the late 9th century. Green fields on either side, winding rivers, the air heavy with smoke from distant hearths. But then suddenly the language changes. The customs, the laws, even the names of the town sound foreign. You haven't crossed an ocean, just an invisible border. You've entered the Danelaw, a country within a country, born from fire, war, and uneasy peace. The Danelaw wasn't just land taken by force. It was an entirely new way of life carved into the heart of England. When the Vikings came, they didn't all return home with loot and legends. Many stayed. They built homes, farms, and towns. They brought their own laws, Danelaw, literally, the law of the Danes. And those laws shaped everything from justice to taxes to inheritance. To the west lay the realm of the Anglo-Saxons, Alfred's Wessex and later Mercia, holding on to the old English ways. To the east and north stretched the Danelaw, where Norse words filled the air and carved stones bore runes instead of Latin. It was as if England had split into two hearts beating to two different rhythms. But here's the strange part. The Danelaw wasn't constant chaos. It was remarkably organised. The Danes established fortified towns called byres, from which we still get names like Derby, Whitby and Grimsby. Their law was harsh but consistent. Their trade routes flourished. Silver from the east, furs from the north, wine from the continent. Markets bustled, ships came and went, and towns grew rich under the watchful eye of Viking jarls and governors. For the ordinary farmer, life didn't stop. It adapted. English and Norse families intermarried. Their children grew up speaking both tongues, blending words and traditions into something entirely new. Even today, our everyday English carries traces of that mingling. Words like sky, egg, knife, window, all gifts from the Danelaw. Still, peace was never simple. To Alfred's people, the Danelaw was both a scar and a challenge. Proof that their homeland had been conquered, yet a reminder of what could be reclaimed. Alfred's burghs on the border weren't just fortresses, they were statements. England will rise again. Over time, the boundaries shifted. Edward the Elder and his sister Æthelflæd chipped away at the Danelaw piece by piece, like masons restoring a broken wall. But even as they won back land, they couldn't erase the mark the Danes had left. By the 10th century, England was no longer the same island that had faced the first Viking raids a century earlier. The Danelaw had changed it forever, not destroyed it, but reshaped it. It gave England new towns, new bloodlines, and a new identity forged between sword and plough. And when, generations later, Danish kings like Cnut would sit on the English throne, they ruled not as outsiders, but as heirs to both worlds, Saxon and Norse, cross and hammer, law and legend. The Danelaw was division, yes, but also creation. From its split heart, a stronger England would one day emerge. King Cnut and the North Sea Empire. Close your eyes and picture the North Sea in the early 11th century. Grey waves stretching to the horizon, winds whipping across narrow ships, and men hardened by cold and battle gripping their oars. This was the world of Cnut the Great, a Viking prince who would rise from those stormy seas to become one of England's most extraordinary rulers. Cnut didn't inherit England peacefully. He was a conqueror, a man who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of land. In the year 1001 he first set foot on English soil as a raider, leading fleets that terrified coastal towns. But unlike earlier invaders, Cnut was patient, strategic, and ambitious. He didn't just want loot, he wanted a crown. By the year 1010, after years of war, diplomacy, and clever alliances, Cnut claimed the English throne. But his vision didn't stop at England. He imagined something far greater, a North Sea empire stretching across England, Denmark, and Norway. For the first time, a ruler could command the northern waters almost as easily as the land itself. Cnut ruled with a combination of Viking pragmatism and Anglo-Saxon wisdom. He kept many of Alfred's laws and the boors that had saved England from earlier raids. He didn't just impose fear, he sought loyalty, blending Danish power with English administration. For merchants, priests, and peasants alike, life became surprisingly stable. England under Cnut was prosperous, secure, and respected across Europe. He was also a master of politics. Cnut married Emma of Normandy, widow of King Æthelflæd, securing alliances that would shape the future of England and France. He attended church ceremonies donated to monasteries and encouraged learning, a far cry from the Viking stereotype of relentless raiders. People called him king, but many whispered that he was also something else, a bridge between cultures, a man who had turned conquest into governance. Yet even as Cnut ruled from England, his empire was vast and unwieldy. He relied on loyal earls and governors to manage distant lands, sending messages across the sea that could take weeks to reach their destination. Imagine the challenge, holding Denmark, Norway and England together, all while keeping restless nobles and ambitious sons in check. It required as much cunning as courage, and Cnut had both in abundance. Under his reign, England prospered. Trade flourished with the continent and Scandinavia. Law and order were respected. The terror that had once defined the Vikings transformed into structure and stability. For the first time, many Englishmen realised that a Danish king could be just as legitimate as a Saxon one, perhaps even better. Cnut's empire didn't last forever. After his death, the unity of the North Sea Empire fractured. But his reign left a lasting imprint. An England that had endured Viking conquest, absorbed foreign rulers, and emerged stronger and more sophisticated than ever. He proved that strength alone could win a crown, but vision, justice, and diplomacy could build a kingdom that lasted. And through Cnut, the idea of England, of a nation that could survive both chaos and conquest, continued to grow. Next, we'll see the fragile years after Cnut's death, the decline of the Viking kings and the return of the House of Wessex, in the fall of the House of Wessex. The fall of the House of Wessex. By the mid-11th century, England had seen kings rise and fall like tides, and the once mighty House of Wessex, the dynasty that had given Alfred the Great and Edward the Elder to the island, was nearing its twilight. After centuries of battles against Vikings, Danes, and rival earls, the line that had built the foundation of England faced its ultimate test. survival itself. It began quietly, in the corridor of power. Edward the Confessor, one of the last of the Wessex line, ascended the throne in the early 11th century. He was pious, learned, and deeply committed to the church, a king more comfortable with prayer than battle. Yet England was not a kingdom that could be ruled by piety alone. Viking blood still flowed in the north, ambitious earls vied for influence, and foreign powers watched eagerly for a chance to intervene. Edward's reign was marked by tension beneath calm. He had no children, leaving the throne uncertain, and factions at court began to manoeuvre, each seeking advantage. The House of Wessex had built England, yes, but it had also inherited centuries of unresolved rivalries. And when Edward died in the year 1066, the vacuum was immediate, sharp, and dangerous. Suddenly, England faced a choice: a king from the Wessex line or a new ruler from abroad. Harold Godwinson, Edward's powerful earl and brother-in-law, was crowned, but the kingdom was vulnerable. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. And from the north, Harold Hardrada of Norway, a Viking king with a claim rooted in blood and ambition, prepared to invade. The House of Wessex, once unshakable, could no longer hold the kingdom together. Its strength had always relied on lineage, loyalty, and long practice of governance. But now, all of that was threatened by external armies and internal uncertainty. England, built from the ashes of chaos, was about to face its greatest battle yet, a confrontation that would decide not just the next king, but the destiny of the entire nation. In a few short weeks, England would be transformed. The fields of Hastings would run with blood. The line of Wessex would be broken. And yet, even in defeat, the legacy of Alfred, Edward, and their descendants would survive in law, language, and the very idea of an English nation. The fall of the House of Wessex was tragic, yes, but it was not the end. It was the prelude to something new: the Plantagenets, the Normans, and a kingdom that would emerge stronger for having been tested. Next, we will follow the aftermath of Hastings in the Norman conquest. A new dynasty emerges. The Norman invasion, 1066, and the death of Old England. Imagine the morning of October 14, 1066. The air is tense, the fields near Hastings quiet except for the distant march of armies. England, a land that had survived Roman legacies, Saxon kings and Viking raids, was about to face its most shocking upheaval yet. The Norman army, led by William, Duke of Normandy, advanced, its banners snapping in the wind. Across the field, Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, readied his men, determined to defend the land of his ancestors. The battle would last hours, but its consequences would echo for centuries. Harold fought bravely, according to legend even struck down by an arrow to the eye, but the Normans triumphed. England's rulers, its structures, its culture, everything built over centuries under the House of Wessex, was shattered in a single day of bloodshed. It wasn't just a victory, it was a transformation. William didn't merely take a crown, he took an entire kingdom and reshaped it from top to bottom. Castles sprang up like iron teeth in the landscape, symbols of control and conquest. The old Saxon lords were replaced by Norman nobles loyal to the new king. English law, customs, and language were challenged, blended, and in some cases buried beneath new systems imported from Normandy. Yet it wasn't total annihilation. The English people remained, the fields still grew crops, the rivers still ran, and the town still hummed with life. What changed was leadership and vision. William introduced feudalism in a way England had never known, a hierarchy binding land, loyalty, and military service into a single, tightly organised system. It was foreign, powerful, and sometimes cruel, but it brought stability after a century of invasions and rebellion. The Normans also brought administration and record-keeping on an unprecedented scale. The Domesday Book, completed decades later, mapped every village, every field, and every tax owed. For the first time, England was seen not just as a patchwork of kingdoms, but as a single governable nation, though its heart was now Norman. Culturally, the Norman influence was profound. French became the language of the court and the elite, shaping English vocabulary for generations. Romanesque architecture rose from the soil, stone cathedrals, imposing castles, and grand keeps that replaced the wooden halls of the Anglo-Saxons. The very identity of England was being rewritten, forged from conquest, resilience, and adaptation. And yet amid all the change, traces of the old England remained. Saxon villages persisted. Burhs Alfred had built still stood. Laws, though modified, carried echoes of Wessex and Danelaw governance. The people, their language, their land, these could not be entirely conquered. They would survive, adapt, and eventually merge with the newcomers, creating a New England stronger and richer for its turbulent history. The Norman invasion was a death. Yes, the death of Old England. But it was also a beginning. From the ashes of Hastings arose a kingdom united under a single dynasty, a kingdom ready to evolve, thrive, and face the future with a new heart. Norman rule. Castles, feudalism, and control picture England after Hastings. The fields are still green, the rivers still wind through valleys, but everything else has changed. Wooden halls and Saxon burhs have given way to stone castles, rising like jagged teeth from hills and river banks. The Normans had arrived not just as rulers, but as masters, and their tools of power were as much about fear as protection. Castles were more than homes for Norman lords. They were symbols of authority, built to dominate the landscape and remind the people who held the power. From enormous motte and bailey fortresses to the stone keeps that would later inspire awe across Europe, these structures controlled trade routes, rivers and villages. Step inside one, and you'd see garrisoned soldiers, storehouses of grain, and walls so high that rebellion seemed almost impossible. To a local villager, a castle wasn't just architecture. It was a constant reminder that the world had shifted and the rules were no longer theirs. But castles alone could not secure an entire kingdom. William and his successors relied on feudalism, a system as intricate as the castles themselves. Land was divided into fiefs, held by loyal nobles in exchange for military service. Each noble had vassals, and each vassal had tenants, binding everyone into a network of obligations that kept the king's power secure. Loyalty became currency. A failure to serve or a hint of rebellion could cost life, land, or both. It was a hierarchy that extended into every village and hamlet, creating a chain of accountability that reinforced Norman authority. The system reached deep into daily life. Farmers owed rent, labour, or produce to their lords. Knights trained constantly, ready to serve the lord above them in times of war. Justice was meted out from the Lord's Hall, and taxes flowed upward like water in a channel, ultimately filling the royal coffers. Normans were meticulous administrators, imposing order where chaos had often reigned. The Domesday Book, completed in the late 11th century, recorded every village, field and ox, a testament to the king's control and the reach of Norman governance. Yet it wasn't all oppression. The new system brought stability to a land long fractured by Viking raids and internal conflict. Roads improved, connecting towns and fostering trade. Markets became reliable, encouraging crafts, merchants, and the flow of goods across England. For all its strictures, Norman rule created predictability that had been absent for generations. A peasant might still toil, but at least he knew the rhythm of taxes, rents, and obligations, and could plan his life within that framework. Of course, control bred resentment. Saxons watched their lands and power vanish. Revolts flared, sometimes crushed swiftly. sometimes simmering for decades. William himself led campaigns to subdue the north, burning villages and imposing order with brutal efficiency. Norman rule was secure, but always maintained through a tense balance of fear, loyalty, and ambition. England was being reshaped by conquest, and the scars of resistance were etched into both land and memory. Culture too began to change. French became the language of the court, of law and of aristocratic life, while English remained the tongue of the common people. Churches and monasteries adopted Romanesque architecture, replacing modest wooden Saxon halls with soaring stone arches and grand designs that reflected the power of the new rulers. Monks copied manuscripts in lavishly decorated script, learning from continental Europe, while the arts and literature slowly flourished under Norman influence. England was transforming physically, socially, and linguistically, a fusion of old and new, Saxon and Norman. The castles, the feudal hierarchy, and the administrative reforms were not merely tools of domination. They were the building blocks of a stronger, more centralised England. The Normans had conquered with blood and strategy, but in doing so they also laid the foundations of the medieval English state. By uniting law, military power, and governance under a king who demanded loyalty, they created a system that could endure for centuries, capable of adapting to both internal strife and external threats. In villages, towns, and cities across the kingdom, life adjusted. Norman officials enforced order, peasants tilled the land under new obligations, and lords balanced their own ambitions against the king's authority. England was no longer a loose collection of territories. It was a kingdom being meticulously organised, mapped, and fortified. The echoes of Saxon England lingered, but the shape of the future was unmistakably Norman: stone, law, loyalty, and control. By the time William's descendants looked out over the land, they could see the lasting imprint of conquest, a kingdom held together by castles, by networks of loyalty, and by administration that touched every corner of daily life. The Normans had arrived as conquerors, but they also became the architects of a new England, a medieval nation ready to face the challenges of kings, barons, and the centuries ahead. Next, we'll step into the meticulous world of the Domesday Book, where William's vision of a fully counted, fully controlled England comes alive in ink and parchment. The Domesday Book, counting a conquered land. Imagine being a farmer in late 11th century England. You've survived Viking raids, navigated local disputes, and endured the upheaval of conquest, and now a new king, William the Conqueror, sits firmly on the throne. One day, officials arrive in your village, their expressions serious, parchments and quills in hand. They ask pointed questions. How many oxen do you own? How many acres of land? Who tends it? What taxes have you paid, and to whom? Answer truthfully, or face consequences. This monumental survey was known as the Domesday Book, completed in the year 1086, and it was unlike anything England had ever seen. Its purpose was deceptively simple: to know exactly what the king owned and what his subjects owed him. But simple didn't mean small. Every village, farm, mill, and even livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, was counted. Every detail of the landscape and its productivity was recorded. The book was meticulous, precise, and revolutionary for its time. Why such exhaustive detail? For William, knowledge was power. England had been conquered, but it had not yet been fully controlled. Landholders were unsettled, Saxon lords had been displaced, and the potential for rebellion lingered. By counting every acre, livestock, and household, William could assert authority, ensure taxes were paid, and prevent uprisings before they could grow. In essence, the Domesday Book transformed England from a patchwork of scattered feudal holdings into a kingdom that could be governed with unprecedented efficiency. Surveyors travelled across the countryside, speaking with villagers, monks, and nobles. They recorded the state of the land before the conquest and compared it to the present. They noted disputes over ownership, losses during the invasion, and gains by Norman lords. Each entry was a story of survival, ambition, adaptation, or betrayal, carefully etched into the king's record. Imagine the audacity of it. A king who could map an entire kingdom, not with armies or banners, but with ink and parchment. The Domesday Book was more than administration, it was a declaration. It told the people of England, your king knows, sees and records everything, and ultimately all belongs to him. It was a demonstration of authority, a tool of control, and a psychological reminder that the crown was present in every corner of the land. Yet, beyond power, it also left a historical treasure. For historians today, it is a window into life in Norman England, the layout of villages, the names of landholders, the number of livestock, and the relative wealth of communities. It preserved a society in transformation, caught between its Saxon past and Norman present. Consider the broader significance. Before William, few rulers had so exact a grasp on their kingdom. Laws were inconsistent, taxes were irregular, and the power of local lords often outweighed the crown. The Domesday Book made governance accountable, organised, and modern in its scope. It showed that control did not rest solely on swords and armies, but on knowledge, the ability to see, record, and understand the land and its people. For the common English villager, life continued under Norman rule, but now every act, every plough, and every barn fell under the watchful eye of the king's surveyors. Burned Saxon villages were rebuilt, Norman stone keeps dotted the landscape, and the kingdom gradually transformed. England, once a land of scattered communities, was now measurable, manageable, and woven together by bureaucracy as much as by loyalty or conquest. The Domesday Book also underscored a new social reality. It created a permanent record that could be referenced in disputes, ensuring that property claims and obligations were enforceable. Lords and peasants alike knew that the crown's memory was precise, and that any attempt to cheat or hide assets would be difficult. In a sense, the Domesday Book was both sword and shield. It empowered the king while protecting property rights within the framework of law. Its influence stretched far beyond its own century. The Domesday Book became a benchmark for governance, taxation, and administration. England would carry forward the principle that a well-ordered kingdom required knowledge of its people, lands, and resources, an insight that shaped royal authority and bureaucracy for centuries to come. It was a foundation not just for taxation, but for stability, law, and the very identity of England as a governed, coherent nation. From the burned villages of Saxon resistance to the new Norman strongholds, the survey captured a land in transition. The Domesday Book wasn't just a ledger, it was a mirror reflecting England's past, its present, and its potential. It preserved the memory of conquest and the power of organisation, showing that the strength of a kingdom lay as much in its record-keeping as in its castles and armies. By the time Henry I's successors and the Plantagenets came to power, England had already been measured, counted, and controlled. The Domesday Book remained a testament to William's vision. A kingdom conquered, yes, but also mapped, understood, and governed in ways the world had never seen before. Next, we will explore the turbulence of the next generation in the Anarchy, when England lost its king, a period when control of this meticulously recorded land would be fiercely contested, and the lessons of William's survey would be put to the ultimate test. The Anarchy, when England lost its king, imagine a land without a ruler, a throne claimed by two rivals, and a nation split between loyalty and survival. That was England in the middle of the 12th century, a country that had once stood proud under strong kings, now torn apart by ambition, betrayal, and endless war. The people would later call it the Anarchy, and for nearly 20 years it would test the very limits of England's endurance. It began with the death of King Henry V in the year 1135. The king had ruled firmly and wisely, but tragedy had struck when his only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster years earlier. With no male heir, Henry named his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as his successor, a bold and unprecedented decision in a world where power was rarely handed to women. But despite the oaths of loyalty sworn to her, many barons were uneasy. They feared a woman's rule, and they feared even more her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, a rival power in France. So when Henry died, the crown did not smoothly pass to Matilda. Instead, her cousin Stephen of Blois, quick and cunning, crossed the Channel and claimed the throne for himself. He was crowned king with the support of powerful nobles and the church, and for a brief moment it seemed England might avoid disaster. But Matilda would not yield. The rightful heir by blood, she raised her own army and invaded, determined to take back what she believed was hers. What followed was not a single war, but countless small ones, a storm that spread across the land. Every castle became a fortress of loyalty or rebellion, every village became a pawn. Chroniclers described a kingdom turned into a nightmare, towns burned, families ruined, fields trampled into wastelands. Mercenaries, paid with promises rather than coin, ravaged the countryside for food and gold. It was said that Christ and his saints slept, a haunting reflection of the suffering that touched even the church itself. Stephen, for all his charm, struggled to maintain control. His promises of peace meant little when lords acted as kings in their own domains. Matilda, fierce and unyielding, at times seemed on the verge of victory, once even capturing Stephen himself, but her sharp temper and proud demeanour alienated potential allies. The struggle became a stalemate, a long and grinding conflict that wore down both sides and left the common people exhausted. Still, the chaos revealed much about England's spirit. Local communities adapted to survive without royal protection. Markets reorganised, villages built their own defences, and in some places fragile systems of local justice kept order where the crown could not. It was as if the people of England, abandoned by their rulers, learned to govern themselves. A quiet, stubborn endurance that kept the nation from total ruin. In the midst of bloodshed, a child was growing, Matilda's son, Henry. He watched, learned, and waited. By the early 1150s, the weary kingdom was desperate for stability. Negotiations began. Matilda's forces and Stephen's loyalists came together, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. The Treaty of Wallingford in the year 1153 ended the madness. Stephen would remain king until his death, but he agreed to recognise Henry as his heir. When Stephen died a year later, Henry Plantagenet took the throne as King Henry II. Young, shrewd and relentless, he would restore order to a nation that had forgotten what peace felt like. The Anarchy, though devastating, had prepared the ground for reform. It taught the monarchy that power must be clear and lawful, and it taught the people that England itself, its farms, its towns, its faith, could outlast even the collapse of kingship. By the time calm finally returned, the landscape had changed. New castles dotted the hills, built not for glory but for survival. Families were scattered, yet communities had learned independence. The old feudal loyalties were shaken, but out of the ruins rose a stronger sense of unity, a kingdom that had been tested and endured. The Anarchy was more than just a civil war. It was a reckoning. It revealed how fragile order could be, and how powerful the will to rebuild was. And when Henry II ascended the throne, he inherited not just a broken country, but a people who had already proven that even in their darkest hour, England would not fall. Henry II, the Lawgiver king. Imagine a kingdom still scarred by decades of civil war. The countryside is dotted with half-ruined castles, towns still whisper of famine and betrayal, and peasants remember the years when rival lords fought over the crown. Into this fractured world rode Henry II, a fiery, brilliant young man of just 21 years old, crowned in the year 1154 as the first Plantagenet King of England. Henry's rise marked the end of a dark chapter known as the Anarchy, the brutal civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda, Henry's mother. England had been torn apart, law and loyalty both shattered. Banditry was rampant, castles had become private fortresses of rebellion, and royal justice barely existed. When Henry ascended the throne, his task was not just to rule, but to rebuild. And in doing so, he would become one of the most transformative monarchs in English history. From the start, Henry was unlike any king before him. Tireless, intelligent, and often mercurial, he had a mind that burned with ideas. He didn't see the crown as a prize, he saw it as a system to be repaired, expanded, and perfected. His empire stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Territories so vast they were said to rival even the holdings of the French king. Yet for all his continental power, Henry's focus was England. He wanted a kingdom of order, not chaos, one where justice, not brute force, governed the land. To achieve that, Henry turned his attention to law, the foundation of authority. Under his predecessors, justice was inconsistent. Local lords often imposed their own rules, collecting fines and punishing subjects however they pleased. Henry changed that. He reclaimed royal justice as the rightful domain of the crown. He introduced reforms that would form the backbone of English common law, a system based not on shifting local custom, but on uniform principles applied across the kingdom. He sent out itinerant justices, royal judges who travelled from shire to shire hearing cases on the king's behalf. These judges kept written records of their decisions, creating a body of precedent that helped ensure fairness and consistency. For the first time, ordinary people could appeal to the king's court if they were wronged by their local lord. It was a revolutionary concept. The law applied to everyone, and the king was its ultimate guardian. Henry also introduced key administrative tools that strengthened both justice and royal control. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 and the Assize of Northampton in 1176 established procedures for criminal investigation, trials by jury and property disputes. These reforms laid the groundwork for a justice system that valued evidence and public inquiry over private vengeance. In many ways, Henry created the first recognisable form of modern legal government, a state where law, not bloodline or brute strength, held supreme power. His legal brilliance was matched by his energy. Chroniclers described him as restless, constantly in motion, rarely still. He was known to work long hours, dictating letters, overseeing disputes, and personally reviewing cases. He valued efficiency and accountability, qualities rare among medieval kings. He also took a keen interest in royal finances, reforming taxation, and ensuring that the king's revenue was steady, transparent, and centrally managed. But Henry's genius came with a temper. He could be impulsive, quick to anger, and unforgiving to those who challenged him, including his own family. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, was both a political alliance and a fiery partnership. Together they had 8 children, but as those children grew, so did the rivalries between them and their father. Henry's sons, especially Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, resented his refusal to share real power. In the years 1173 to 1175, they rebelled against him, encouraged in part by Eleanor herself. The rebellion was crushed, but the scars it left, both political and personal, ran deep. Henry would spend the rest of his life struggling to control his ambitious sons, whose rivalries would one day tear the dynasty apart. Yet the most famous conflict of Henry's reign wasn't with his family. It was with his friend turned foe, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their clash over whether clergy should be tried in royal courts or church courts became a defining struggle between crown and church. Henry determined that no one, not even priests, should be above his law, pushed hard to assert royal authority. Becket resisted, defending the church's independence. Their friendship shattered, and in one of history's most infamous moments, Henry's frustration boiled over into the fateful outburst. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" 4 knights took those words as an order and murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in the year 1170. The murder sent shockwaves across Europe. Henry's name was cursed by the church, and public outrage forced him into penance. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, allowing monks to whip him, a king humbling himself before faith. It was a moment that revealed the limits of royal power and the cost of pride. Despite this tragedy, Henry's reign left an enduring mark. His reforms created a centralised monarchy, one that no longer depended entirely on noble loyalty, but on institutions, written law, and royal officials. England became a functioning state, something few kingdoms in Europe could claim at the time. The seeds of parliamentary government, the rule of law, and the rights of subjects were all planted under Henry's reign, even if their full bloom would come centuries later. By the time Henry died in the year 1189, exhausted and betrayed by his sons, his body was worn down but his legacy unshakable. He left behind a kingdom not merely held together by fear or conquest, but by structure, by systems that could endure beyond any single ruler. Henry VI was not a saint, nor was he a peaceful king. He was hot-tempered, flawed, and often ruthless. Yet through his relentless drive for order and justice, he gave England one of its greatest gifts, a stable foundation built on law rather than chaos. His reign transformed kingship from a personal possession into an institution, one that could stand the test of time. He was, above all, the Lawgiver king, a man who turned a ravaged realm into a nation governed by reason, precedent, and the promise that even power itself must answer to justice. Eleanor of Aquitaine, power, passion, and politics. Close your eyes and imagine the courts of 12th century Europe. Great halls lit by torches, musicians playing lutes, the scent of wine and roasted meat drifting through the air, and voices, dozens of voices, whispering about alliances, love affairs, and treachery. At the centre of it all stood one woman who defied every rule of her age, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a duchess who became a queen twice, a mother to kings, and one of the most powerful figures of the medieval world. Eleanor's story began in the glittering cultured court of Aquitaine, a land larger and richer than the Kingdom of France itself. When her father, Duke William the Raekid, died in the year 1137, Eleanor, then still a teenager, inherited his titles, wealth, and vast territories. In an era when most women were bartered into marriage for land or alliance, Eleanor was the land and the alliance. Her inheritance made her the most desirable heiress in Europe, and every noble house watched her future with hungry eyes. Her first marriage was to Louis VII of France, a pious young king more comfortable among monks than courtiers. Their union joined Aquitaine to France, but the two could not have been more different. Louis was devout and cautious. Eleanor was spirited, outspoken, and proud. She loved poetry, music, and politics, passions that clashed with her husband's ascetic nature. Their marriage grew cold, and the tensions deepened during the Second Crusade, which they undertook together in the year 1147. In the Holy Land, their differences erupted publicly. While Louis sought divine redemption, Eleanor travelled as a duchess warrior, commanding her own vassals and insisting on being treated as an equal. Rumours of scandal, of flirtations, even of impropriety, spread through the crusading camp. When they returned to Europe, the rift between them was irreparable. The marriage was annulled in 1152, officially on the grounds of consanguinity, but in truth, because Eleanor refused to live in the shadow of a man who did not understand her. Only months later, she shocked the world by marrying Henry Plantagenet, the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a man nearly a decade her junior. 2 years later, he became King Henry II of England, and Eleanor was once again a queen, this time of a realm far more dynamic and far-reaching than France. Their marriage united vast territories, forming what would later be called the Angevin Empire, stretching from the borders of Scotland to the mountains of southern France. Henry and Eleanor's partnership was as volatile as it was powerful. Together they were a force of nature, both intelligent, passionate, and unyielding. She advised him in matters of state, arranged alliances, and managed her own duchy with authority that rivalled any man's. Chroniclers describe her travelling across Aquitaine on horseback, presiding over courts of justice, negotiating treaties, and commanding loyalty from vassals who adored her. But the same strength that made her indispensable also made her dangerous. Henry, fiery and ambitious, grew frustrated by her independence. Their marriage, once founded on passion, deteriorated into rivalry. When their sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, rose in rebellion against their father in the years 1173 to 1175, Eleanor sided with them. Whether driven by political calculation, maternal instinct, or resentment toward Henry, her support was a bold and perilous act. The rebellion failed. Henry's response was merciless. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned. For over 15 years she lived under house arrest, guarded but never entirely silenced. Even in confinement, her presence loomed large in politics. She corresponded with allies, counselled her sons in secret, and remained a symbol of resistance and royal dignity. When Henry II died in 1189, Eleanor was released by her son, now King Richard the Fawned, Richard the Lionheart. Age had not dulled her mind nor her resolve. She ruled as regent in his absence while he fought in the Third Crusade, managing England with a steady hand and earning the respect even of her former enemies. Later, when Richard's brother John ascended the throne, she continued to act as a mediator, travelling tirelessly across Europe to secure alliances and protect the stability of her family's rule. Beyond politics, Eleanor was a patron of art, culture, and chivalry. The courts of Aquitaine and Poitiers flourished under her guidance, becoming centres of poetry and learning. She nurtured troubadours and poets who celebrated ideals of courtly love and knightly virtue, ideas that would shape European culture for centuries. Her court was said to be a place where intellect, wit, and artistry were as valued as strength and bloodline. What made Eleanor remarkable was not only her longevity, living into her 80s in an age when most women did not survive half as long, but her adaptability. She lived through 3 kingships, 2 marriages, rebellions, crusades, and the birth of an empire. She navigated each transformation with the precision of a stateswoman and the passion of a woman determined to be more than a name in a lineage. When she died in the year 1182, she was buried beside Henry II at Fontevraud Abbey in France, 2 figures whose tempestuous love and rivalry had defined an age. Her tomb shows her holding an open book, as though still reading, still learning, even in death, an image perfectly capturing the intellect and spirit that had guided her entire life. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story is that of a woman who refused to be silent in a world ruled by men. She was both a mother and a monarch, a lover and a strategist, a patron of art and a participant in war. Her legacy endures not only in her descendants, kings like Richard the Lionheart and John, but in the very idea that power, when coupled with intelligence and will, transcends gender and expectation. Eleanor was, in every sense, a queen who ruled her world, not from the throne alone, but from the heart of Europe's politics, poetry, and power. Thomas Becket, the Martyr and the Monarch. Imagine the grand halls of Canterbury Cathedral, the flicker of candles throwing long shadows across cold stone, the murmur of monks whispering prayers that echo softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Into this sacred space walked Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, a man whose destiny would forever intertwine faith and defiance, friendship and betrayal. His story would become one of the most powerful symbols of conscience against authority in all of medieval England. Becket's beginnings were far from noble. Born to a prosperous London merchant family, he was neither a knight nor a lord, but a man of intellect, charm, and ambition. His quick wit and remarkable administrative skill caught the attention of powerful men, eventually bringing him into the orbit of Henry Thend, a brilliant, fiery king determined to restore order after years of civil chaos. Becket rose swiftly through the ranks, and by the year 1154 he was appointed Lord Chancellor of England. In this role, Becket was everything Henry could have hoped for. He managed royal finances, negotiated with nobles, and even led troops in battle when required. The two men shared more than power. They shared laughter, hunting trips, and long conversations late into the night. Chroniclers describe them as inseparable, two minds perfectly aligned in their vision of a strong, centralised monarchy. To Henry, Thomas Becket was not just a servant of the crown, he was a friend and almost a brother. Then, in the year 1158, came the decision that changed everything. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry appointed Becket to the post, expecting his loyal chancellor to extend royal influence into the church. It was a political masterstroke, or so Henry believed. But something in Becket changed. Upon donning the robes of an archbishop, he shed the ambitions of a courtier and embraced the convictions of a priest. Where Henry saw loyalty to the crown, Becket now saw duty to God. He resigned as chancellor, adopted a life of austerity, and began defending the church's rights with fervour. Issues that had once seemed administrative became moral crusades, especially the question of whether clergy accused of crimes should be tried in royal courts. Becket argued they should remain under church jurisdiction. Henry, furious, saw this as defiance, a direct challenge to his authority. Their friendship shattered. What had once been affection turned into bitterness and suspicion. The king felt betrayed. Becket, cornered by conscience, refused to yield. Excommunications flew, councils were divided, and the kingdom trembled under the strain of their feud. In one of history's most fateful outbursts, Henry, driven by rage and humiliation, is said to have exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" Those words, spoken in anger, sealed Becket's fate. 4 knights, loyal to their sovereign, took the king's frustration as an order. They rode to Canterbury, entering the cathedral on a cold December evening in the year 1170. Becket refused to flee. As the monks pleaded with him to seek safety, he stood firm at the altar, declaring that he would not desecrate the house of God by running from his murderers. Moments later, the knights drew their swords. In a flash of steel and horror, the Archbishop of Canterbury fell, his blood staining the very stones where he had prayed. The shock was immediate and immense. Word of Becket's death spread like wildfire across Europe. A king's temper had slain a man of God, and the outrage was unrelenting. Henry VI, tormented by guilt and political pressure, was forced into penance. In one of the most dramatic acts of royal humility ever recorded, the King of England walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, allowing monks to strike him with whips before the martyr's tomb. It was a moment that symbolised the triumph of moral conviction over royal power, and one that forever changed the balance between the church and the crown. Becket was canonised only 3 years later, in the year 1173, and Canterbury became one of the greatest pilgrimage sites in Christendom. Pilgrims from every corner of Europe came to pray at his shrine, seeking healing, forgiveness, or courage. His story became legend, a reminder that even the mightiest king could be brought to his knees by a man of faith. But Becket's legacy went beyond sainthood. His martyrdom forced England to confront a question that would echo through its history. Where does authority end and conscience begin? His death set boundaries for the monarchy and gave the church a lasting moral authority that no sword could erase. For centuries, English kings would remember the lesson of Becket, that even power in all its glory must bow before principle. Thomas Becket's story remains one of courage, conviction, and costly integrity. He was a man who stood against his dearest friend and his king, not out of pride, but out of belief. His blood on the cathedral floor became a testament to the idea that true strength often lies not in ruling others, but in standing firm for what is right. Next, we will explore Richard the Lionheart, warrior king, absent monarch, the son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a ruler whose glory blazed across battlefields abroad, even as his kingdom at home bore the weight of his absence. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior abroad. Close your eyes and imagine the battlefield of Acre, the blinding sun reflecting off steel armour, the roar of siege engines, the thunder of hooves over sand. The air is thick with heat and the smell of sweat and iron. This is where Richard the Word of England, known forever as Richard the Lionheart, found his true kingdom. Not in London or Winchester, but across the sea, amid banners and battle cries. He was a monarch forged in the crucible of war, a man whose legend was written not in ink but in blood and dust. When Richard inherited the throne in the year 1189, England stood at a delicate crossroads. The wounds of civil war had healed under his father, Henry II, whose reforms brought stability and law to a once chaotic land. But Richard was not his father. Where Henry had been patient, pragmatic, and obsessed with order, Richard was restless, daring, and consumed by a warrior's dream. His kingdom was not the fields of England. It was the battlefield of Christendom. Within months of his coronation, Richard set his sights on the Holy Land, joining the Third Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. He poured the kingdom's wealth into ships, weapons, and men. He sold lands, titles, and even official positions to fund his campaign. England, in effect, was mortgaged to finance his vision of glory. And then he was gone, leaving the realm in the hands of regents, a treasury half empty, and a people uncertain of what their new king truly valued. But on the shores of the Mediterranean, Richard came alive. At Acre, his leadership was decisive and his courage unmatched. Chroniclers wrote of him riding fearlessly at the front lines, rallying troops, and inspiring men from across Europe to follow him into the heart of battle. The siege of Acre was brutal and unrelenting, lasting 2 long years, but it ended with a victory that made Richard a legend. Even his enemies respected him, none more so than Saladin, the Muslim general whose intelligence and honour mirrored Richard's own. Their rivalry became one of history's most fascinating duels. 2 great leaders who fought fiercely yet respected each other deeply. Yet, despite his victories, Jerusalem remained out of reach. After years of brutal fighting, neither side could claim complete triumph. The crusade ended not with a conquest but with a treaty, one that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the Holy City, but left the city itself in Muslim hands. For many in Europe, this was a disappointment, but for Richard, it was a practical end to a war that had already cost too much. Back home, however, England was suffering. Taxes were crushing. Rebellions flickered in his absence. His brother, Prince John, conspired with the French king Philip II to seize his throne. The realm was restless and loyalty strained. Yet Richard seemed almost indifferent to it all. His heart remained abroad, with his soldiers, his campaigns, his eternal chase for honour. His return home was nearly as dramatic as his crusade. Shipwrecked in Europe, Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded for his release was staggering: 150,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. To raise the sum, every church, monastery and noble household in the realm was taxed. Silver chalices were melted down, jewels sold, and even peasants were forced to contribute. It was a national effort to free their absent king, and a measure of how deeply his legend had already taken root. When he finally returned, Richard found a kingdom weary but loyal. He forgave John, punished traitors, and reaffirmed his rule with typical grandeur. But even then, England was little more than a stopover. He soon returned to France to defend his territories against Philip II, where he once again took up the sword, the only throne he truly seemed to care for. In the year 1199, while besieging a minor castle in Limousin, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and the warrior king died shortly after, far from home, on foreign soil, as if fate itself insisted that his life end as it was lived, in battle. Richard the Lionheart's legacy is one of brilliance and contradiction. He was a commander of unmatched skill, a symbol of chivalry and courage whose name echoed through ballads and chronicles. To his contemporaries, he was the perfect knight, bold, noble, and indomitable. Yet, as a ruler, his absence left England vulnerable and overburdened. His reign, though glorious abroad, strained his people at home. He gave them pride, but at a heavy cost. And so, Richard remains a paradox: the king who inspired legends but ruled from afar, the lion who roared across continents but left his den untended. His life reminds us that greatness in war and greatness in rule are not always the same. One builds glory, the other builds nations. Next, we will explore John Lackland, from prince to king, whose troubled reign would challenge the very foundations of English monarchy and law, and whose failures would lead to one of history's most enduring symbols of liberty, the Magna Carta. King John and the Birth of Liberty picture England at the turn of the 13th century, castles looming over crowded market towns, peasants bent over their fields beneath grey skies, and the scent of wood smoke rising from a land ruled with a heavy hand. The Plantagenet dynasty had made England powerful, but also restless. Beneath the surface of royal splendour lay resentment, fear, and the growing awareness that even a king could go too far. At the centre of this turmoil stood John, known to history as Lackland, a king both shrewd and disastrous, whose failures would unwittingly give rise to one of humanity's most enduring symbols of freedom, the Magna Carta. John ascended the throne in the year 1199, after the death of his legendary brother, Richard the Lionheart. The contrast between them could not have been sharper. Richard was a soldier king, celebrated for courage and crusades. John was a man of calculation, suspicion, and political cunning. Yet behind his intelligence lurked insecurity, a deep fear of losing control. That fear would define his reign and ultimately destroy it. From the start, John inherited a kingdom on the edge. His brother's wars had drained England's treasury, and the Angevin Empire, stretching across France and the British Isles, was fracturing. John's obsession with reclaiming his lost French territories led to endless campaigns funded by brutal taxation at home. His subjects paid heavily for wars they did not believe in and victories they never saw. His political instincts, though sharp, were poisoned by paranoia. He distrusted his barons, spied on his court, and demanded loyalty through fear rather than respect. When his enemies plotted against him, he responded not with diplomacy, but with vengeance, confiscating lands, seizing hostages, and punishing entire families for defiance. Even those who once supported him began to turn away. And then there was his conflict with the Church, a battle that shook England's spiritual foundation. When Pope Innocent III appointed Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, John refused to accept him, declaring his own authority supreme. The Pope responded with a devastating weapon, an interdict which suspended all church services in England. Bells went silent. Marriages could not be blessed. The dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. For 6 long years, England lived in religious limbo. It was a punishment that struck fear into the hearts of the people, not because they despised their king, but because they feared for their souls. Eventually John capitulated, surrendering England to the Pope as a papal fief and paying an annual tribute to Rome. It was an act that humiliated the crown and further enraged his barons. By the year 1213, England was on the verge of rebellion. The barons, powerful lords who commanded their own armies, had reached their breaking point. John's taxes were unbearable, his justice arbitrary, and his wars hopeless. They gathered in secret councils, pledging to confront the king not with swords, but with demands. 2 years later, in the year 1215, the confrontation came to a head at Runnymede, a quiet meadow along the River Thames. There, under the watch of armed men and uneasy priests, King John affixed his seal to a document that would change the world, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. It was not a declaration of democracy, nor a cry for revolution. At first glance, it was a peace treaty, a list of grievances, promises, and legal constraints designed to protect the rights of the barons. But within its clauses lay principles that would outgrow their medieval context. It declared that no one, not even the king, was above the law. It forbade imprisonment without lawful judgment, the early seed of what would become habeas corpus. It insisted that taxes required consent, and that justice could not be sold or delayed. In a single moment, power, once believed to descend solely from the crown, was forced to share its seat with law. The idea that rulers were accountable, that authority had limits, and that individuals had rights, however narrowly defined at first, had entered English thought. Of course, John never intended to keep his promises. The ink was barely dry before he sought the Pope's support in annulling the charter. Civil war erupted almost immediately, plunging England into chaos once again. The rebel barons even invited a French prince to claim the English throne. But fate had other plans. In the year 1216, John fell ill during a military campaign, weakened by disease and despair. He died at Newark Castle, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to inherit a broken kingdom and a fragile peace. Ironically, the very document John had tried to destroy was reissued by his advisors to stabilise the realm. Over the following decades, it was revised, reaffirmed, and eventually enshrined as a cornerstone of English governance. Its meaning expanded, its spirit endured. What began as a desperate truce between a tyrant and his barons became the foundation of constitutional liberty, not just in England, but across the world. John's reign, though marked by failure, left behind one of history's most transformative legacies. By his excesses, he exposed the dangers of unchecked power. By his downfall, he proved that the rule of law must stand above the rule of kings. And by his death, he left a kingdom forever changed, one that had tasted the idea of liberty and would never again fully surrender it. The story of King John is a reminder that progress often comes through conflict, and that justice is born not in triumph, but in resistance. He was not a hero, far from it. Yet in his shadow, England took one of its greatest steps toward freedom. When we think of liberty today, of rights, of due process, of governments bound by law, we can trace its lineage back to that muddy field at Runnymede, to a flawed, unpopular king, to barons who dared to stand their ground, and to a document that outlived them all. England had survived conquest and civil war, but under John it learned a deeper truth, that even the mightiest crown must bow to the power of principle. The Magna Carta did not end tyranny overnight, but it planted a seed that would grow through the centuries, through parliaments, revolutions, and charters yet to come, And so out of John's misrule came something far greater than his ambition could ever grasp: the birth of liberty. The beginning of a long journey toward rights, representation, and the enduring belief that no man, however powerful, stands above the law. Legacy of the Plantagenets, the making of a nation. Close your eyes and imagine England centuries after Alfred the Great defended Wessex from Viking invaders, after longboats burned villages, after Norman knights carved their castles into the land, and after kings like Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John stamped their names into history. By the late 13th century, the land that had once been a collection of fragile kingdoms had become something extraordinary, a nation. Not yet the England of Shakespeare or Empire, but a place bound by law, loyalty, and a shared sense of identity. This was the legacy of the Plantagenets, the dynasty that took a fractured realm and turned it into the foundation of a modern state. When the Plantagenets first rose to power in the mid-12th century, England was still healing from chaos. Civil war had torn the country apart during the long struggle known as the Anarchy, when rival claims between Stephen and Matilda left castles in ruins and law in disarray. The kingdom needed more than another warrior king, it needed order. And that's exactly what Henry II, the first great Plantagenet ruler, brought to the throne. Henry II's genius wasn't in winning battles, though he could, but in building systems that would outlast him. He restructured the royal administration, extended royal justice into every shire, and created what we now call common law, a legal system not just based on royal whim, but on consistent principles and precedent. It was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people could appeal to royal courts instead of depending solely on the whims of local lords. Justice was becoming something larger than a man. It was becoming an institution. But Henry's reign was far from peaceful. His temper was legendary, his ambitions vast, and his conflicts devastating. His quarrel with his former friend Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, ended in tragedy. A murder that shocked Christendom and forced Henry into public penance. Yet even through scandal, Henry's reforms endured. He left behind a legal system so resilient that echoes of it still shape British and American law today. Then came Richard the Lionheart, the romantic image of medieval kingship. He spent little time in England, leading crusades in distant lands and fighting wars in France, but his legend inspired the imagination of generations. Under Richard, England saw the rise of the knightly ideal, chivalry, courage, and faith. Yet behind the songs of heroism lay heavy taxes and relentless warfare. The cost of glory was high, and the weight of that burden would soon fall on his brother, King John. John's reign was a storm of rebellion and resentment. Known for his cunning but distrusted for his cruelty, he clashed with barons, bishops, and even the Pope. His failures in France cost England much of its continental territory, and his oppressive taxation bred fury among the nobility. But it was John's greatest humiliation that would become England's greatest triumph: the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. At first, the Magna Carta was a peace treaty, a way to end civil war. But its clauses went far beyond immediate politics. It declared that the king was not above the law, that no man could be imprisoned without cause, and that justice could not be sold or delayed. It was in essence a statement that even the most powerful ruler was accountable. Though it was reissued and revised in the years to come, its spirit endured, shaping the very concept of liberty in England and later in the wider world. The Plantagenet legacy wasn't only political or legal, it was deeply cultural. Under their rule, England began to breathe as a unified land rather than a patchwork of Norman conquerors and Anglo-Saxon subjects. By the 13th century, the English language itself was evolving, a fusion of Old Saxon roots, Norman French influence, and Latin scholarship. From this blend, Middle English emerged, the language of Chaucer, of poetry, of law, and of common speech. castles dotted the landscape, not just as symbols of conquest, but as centres of administration and defence. Towns grew around these fortresses, marketplaces, guild halls, cathedrals, connecting the countryside through trade and craft. Roads improved, commerce expanded, and the feudal order slowly gave way to something more structured: governance. Monasteries flourished during this age. They were not just centres of prayer, but of education, innovation, and preservation. Monks copied manuscripts, taught future scholars, and cultivated the land with techniques that spread across Europe. The founding of Oxford and Cambridge universities in this period marked England's transformation into a place of learning and intellectual life, where knowledge became as vital as the sword. Meanwhile, the Plantagenet kings continued to balance power between church, nobility, and crown. Henry III, John's son, rebuilt Westminster Abbey in magnificent Gothic style, turning it into the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Yet even he faced rebellion, as powerful lords like Simon de Montfort demanded that the king listen to his subjects. In 1265, de Montfort summoned what historians call the First Representative Parliament, inviting not just nobles but commoners, knights and burgesses, to take part in governing. It was a small step, but a monumental one. The seeds of parliamentary democracy were being sown. By the time Edward I came to power, the machinery of a true nation-state was in motion. Edward, often called the Hammer of the Scots, was both warrior and administrator. He codified laws, strengthened royal authority, and waged ambitious campaigns to bring Wales and Scotland under English control. His reign was the culmination of centuries of evolution, the transformation of England from a kingdom of warlords into a centralised, law-bound state. Yet, for all their achievements, the Plantagenets were never free from turmoil. Their dynasty was filled with family feuds, betrayals, and bloodshed. Brothers turned on brothers, sons rebelled against fathers, and ambition often outweighed mercy. The very strength that built the kingdom was also what kept it in constant peril. But through those storms, the institutions they built, law, parliament, the crown itself, survived. Culturally, England under the later Plantagenets became a beacon of medieval art and architecture. Cathedrals like Salisbury, York Minster, and Canterbury rose as symbols of both faith and national pride. Literature flourished, music filled the courts, and a distinctly English sense of identity began to take hold, one that blended Saxon endurance, Norman ambition, and Celtic resilience. By the close of the 13th century, England was no longer merely a territory ruled by powerful men. It was a nation. Its people had a shared history, a common language, and a growing belief in law and governance. The echoes of Alfred's dream, of unity, learning, and resilience, had finally taken form. The Plantagenets, for all their flaws, had done what centuries of conquerors could not. They had built something that lasted. Their kings rose and fell, but their systems endured. The laws Henry II created still formed the backbone of English justice. The Magna Carta remained the touchstone of liberty. The parliaments of de Montfort and Edward laid the groundwork for modern government. From Alfred to the Plantagenets, the story of England is not one of perfection, but of persistence. Each invasion, rebellion, and reform added another layer to the national fabric. Each king, whether hero, tyrant, or martyr, contributed to the idea that England was more than its rulers. So when we look back at this age, we see not just a line of monarchs, but the birth of a nation, one built through centuries of struggle, compromise, and vision. The Plantagenets did not create England in a day, but they gave it its bones, law, identity, and endurance. And that is their true legacy, a kingdom forged from chaos, tested by fire, and united by the will of its people. An England ready at last to stand on its own.